Sophie's hands trembled over the chart that would destroy everything. In the fluorescent hum of St. Augustine Medical Center, she had learned to trust documents more than people, numbers more than explanations, until 17-year-old Evan Drake arrived with a father's smooth lies and injuries that screamed through the silence. The pattern hidden in previous admissions burned through her vision like acid, each notation a breadcrumb leading to a truth the hospital board had already decided to bury. Her own childhood surfaced in fragments, unwanted and sharp, reminding her what happens to children no one chooses to believe. The emergency lockdown she triggered wasn't just about protecting one boy. It was about refusing to become another witness who looked away, even if truth meant demolition. The corridors of St. Augustine Medical Center exhaled disinfectant and secrets in equal measure, their gleaming floors reflecting the nervous pulse of fluorescent lights that hummed a frequency just below conscious hearing. Sophie Marlowe moved through this landscape with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself small, her sneakers whispering against linoleum as she carried her tablet like a shield between her body and the institutional indifference that pressed against every surface. At 29, she had perfected the art of essential invisibility, the way night nurses do when they understand that being noticed often means being blamed. Her dark hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache, her scrubs chosen for their complete absence of personality. The hospital at night was a different creature than its daytime self, stripped of visitors and administrators, reduced to its core function of keeping bodies breathing while the city beyond its walls pretended not to need it. And Sophie had come to prefer this honesty, the way machinery and monitoring systems spoke truths that human mouths refused to form. The medication cart rattled softly as she guided it past room 414, where Mrs. Chen slept fitfully after her third surgery, past the empty nurses' station where Marissa should have been but wasn't, past the waiting area with its exhausted vinyl chairs that had absorbed decades of grief and desperation until they seemed to radiate it back into the stale air. Sophie's shift had started at 11, that threshold hour when the hospital transformed from a place of healing into something more primal, a warehouse for suffering that needed constant vigilance to prevent it from spilling beyond containment, and she had learned to read the particular quality of silence that preceded disaster, the way animals sense earthquakes before the ground begins to move. Her phone vibrated in her pocket with another text from her mother, asking again about Thanksgiving, about whether Sophie would finally come home to Ohio. Questions that felt like accusations wrapped in maternal concern, and she silenced it without reading the full message, because some conversations required more energy than she could spare after 8 hours of monitoring vital signs and pretending not to notice when families lied to themselves about prognoses. The central desk loomed ahead, bathed in the blue glow of multiple monitors displaying heart rates and oxygen levels and the digital surveillance of bodies fighting their various wars against entropy. Sophie logged into the system with fingers that knew the password through muscle memory alone, her eyes scanning the overnight admissions list, even though she'd checked it twice already. A habit born from the time she'd missed a critical update that nearly cost someone their life, a mistake she'd promised herself would remain singular and absolute. The names scrolled past with their attached diagnoses and room assignments, a catalogue of human vulnerability rendered into medical shorthand, until one entry snagged her attention with the sharp insistence of a thorn-catching fabric. Evan Drake, 17 years old, room 422, admitted at 22:47 with multiple contusions, possible concussion, father present and requesting minimal staff interaction. Something in that final notation made her pause, made the skin along her arms prickle with a recognition she couldn't yet name, because requests for privacy in a teaching hospital usually meant either celebrity status or something darker, and the boy's age placed him in that terrible category of almost adult where the system often failed to protect because protection required someone to first acknowledge the need. She pulled up the admission notes, her thumb scrolling through the digital file with increasing disquiet as she absorbed the careful language Dr. Harrison had used, his documentation so meticulously neutral it became suspicious through its very lack of alarm. The injuries were listed with clinical precision: contusions along the right rib cage, consistent with impact trauma, slight swelling around the left eye socket, abrasions on both forearms, elevated stress markers in the initial blood work. The father's statement was recorded verbatim. Evan had fallen down the stairs at their home in Cherry Hills, a wealthy enclave where staircases were built with the kind of solid craftsmanship that didn't usually generate this particular pattern of harm. And the explanation felt rehearsed in a way that made Sophie's jaw tighten with familiar anger. She'd seen this before, these presentations where wealth functioned as a kind of anesthetic, numbing the appropriate questions that should follow certain injuries, and she felt the old fury rising in her chest, the same rage that had driven her into nursing in the first place, the desperate conviction that bodies told truths that mouths refused to speak. The father's name appeared in the records as Marcus Drake, and Sophie recognized it with the hollow sensation of puzzle pieces falling into alignment. Because Marcus Drake owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Denver and sat on the hospital's board of directors, his donations funding the new cardiac wing and ensuring that his family name appeared in bronze lettering in the lobby below. Power had a particular smell in institutional settings, something like expensive cologne mixed with the confidence of never having to explain yourself. And Sophie understood immediately why Dr. Harrison's notes carried that distinctive odor of self-protective vagueness, why the attending physician had documented just enough to satisfy legal requirements while avoiding any language that might imply suspicion or concern. The hospital operated on a ruthless economy of perception, where questioning the wrong person's story could end a career faster than any medical error, and night nurses lived at the bottom of that hierarchy. Their observations easily dismissed as fatigue-induced paranoia or the occupational hazard of seeing too many broken things in dim light. Sophie closed the file and stood motionless for several seconds, letting the information settle into the particular part of her consciousness that had learned to hold uncomfortable truths without immediately acting on them, a skill developed through years of watching the system bend around money and influence while pretending to serve justice equally. The corridor stretched before her in both directions, empty except for the occasional flicker of shadow as equipment lights cycled through their automated routines, and she felt the weight of the shift pressing down with renewed heaviness, because some nights demanded only that you keep people alive until morning, but other nights asked you to decide what kind of person you were willing to become in service of that survival. She thought about walking past room 422 without stopping, about completing her rounds and filing her reports and letting someone else notice what she'd already begun to see. But her feet were already moving toward the boy's door, drawn by an obligation she couldn't articulate and wasn't certain she wanted to honor, because looking closely at things the institution preferred to keep blurred was how you ended up unemployed and blacklisted, and she had rent to pay and student loans that wouldn't forgive themselves just because she'd decided to develop a conscience at an inconvenient moment. Room 422 existed in the particular dimness that hospitals maintained overnight, a compromise between allowing rest and ensuring staff could monitor patients without fumbling in total darkness. And Sophie paused at the threshold to let her eyes adjust, while her ears catalogued the sounds that indicated a space occupied by waking consciousness rather than sleep. Evan Drake sat upright in the mechanized bed, his silhouette angular and tense against the pale blue light filtering through the window blinds. And even from the doorway, Sophie could see how he held himself with the careful rigidity of someone managing pain they didn't want to acknowledge. His breathing shallow and controlled in a way that suggested broken or bruised ribs, despite the x-rays that had supposedly cleared him of fractures. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else. Something sharper that she identified after a moment as fear. That particular human scent that emerged when the body understood it remained in danger even after reaching supposed safety. And she felt her professional assessment clicking into place with the detached precision that allowed her to function in crisis, noting the way his left hand gripped the bedrail with white-knuckled intensity, the slight tremor in his shoulders that had nothing to do with cold. She knocked softly on the open door frame before entering, a courtesy that often got skipped during night rounds, but which felt essential now, a way of announcing herself as someone who understood the violation of having your space invaded without permission. Evan's head turned sharply at the sound, and Sophie caught the flash of panic in his eyes before he managed to smooth his expression into something approximating calm. A transformation so practiced it confirmed every suspicion coiling in her gut. Because 17-year-old boys didn't usually have that kind of defensive control unless they'd spent considerable time learning to hide their reactions from observers who might use their fear against them. Up close, the injuries looked worse than the admission photos had suggested. The bruising around his eye socket already deepening into shades of purple and green that would take weeks to fade. The abrasions on his arms raw enough that she could see where the skin had been scraped away in long, deliberate strips. Patterns that looked less like falling and more like being gripped and dragged across rough surfaces. Sophie introduced herself with the quiet efficiency that night shifts demanded, her voice pitched low to avoid disturbing the fragile peace of the sleeping floor. And she saw Evan relax fractionally when he registered that she was alone, without the entourage of administrators and doctors who had presumably accompanied his initial admission. She began the routine vital signs check, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm with practiced gentleness, while her mind worked through the gap between what the chart claimed and what her eyes could plainly see. The way his entire body flinched when she touched his right side. The careful way he avoided making eye contact for more than a second at a time. Behaviors she recognized from her own adolescence, with a clarity that made her chest feel tight and airless. The boy's pulse was elevated, hammering against her fingertips in a rhythm that suggested sustained anxiety rather than momentary nervousness. And when she asked the standard questions about pain levels and comfort, his answers came in monosyllables that felt rehearsed. Responses designed to minimize attention rather than communicate authentic experience. The silence between them stretched and thinned, and Sophie found herself wanting to ask questions that weren't on any nursing protocol. Questions about what really happened and whether he was safe, and whether anyone had asked him if the story his father told was the story he would tell, if given the choice to speak without witnesses. But those questions lived in dangerous territory that could get her fired or worse, could expose the boy to retaliation if she miscalculated the situation and triggered the wrong intervention. Instead, she finished documenting his vitals and prepared to leave, following the script that would keep her employment secure and her conscience troubled, until Evan spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, asking her if she believed people when they said things were accidents. And the question landed in the room like a confession wrapped in hypothetical language, a test to see whether she was someone who might hear what he couldn't directly say. Sophie stopped at the door, her hand on the frame, feeling the familiar war between self-preservation and the obligation that had driven her into this profession, the conviction that bodies deserved advocates even when advocating meant personal cost. She turned back to look at Evan properly, letting him see that she was considering his question seriously, rather than dismissing it as the rambling of someone on pain medication. And she saw the desperate hope flicker across his face before he locked it down again. That heartbreaking moment when someone who has learned not to expect help catches a glimpse of possible rescue and immediately fears the disappointment that might follow. She told him carefully that she believed bodies told their own stories, regardless of what people claimed with their words, that injuries had patterns and patterns had meanings, and she watched his eyes fill with tears he refused to let fall. Watched him nod once with the understanding that passed between them, an acknowledgement that she'd seen what he needed someone to see, even if she couldn't yet promise what she would do with that seeing. The father's voice reached them before his physical presence did, a hearty boom echoing down the corridor with the confidence of someone who had never learned to modulate himself for institutional spaces. And Sophie watched Evan's entire demeanor shift instantaneously, his spine straightening, his face smoothing into neutrality, his hands loosening their grip on the bedrail to rest casually on his lap, in a performance of ease that was itself a kind of testimony. Marcus Drake appeared in the doorway with the expansive energy of men accustomed to commanding rooms, his expensive suit slightly rumpled from hours in hospital chairs, but still carrying the unmistakable markers of wealth and authority. His silver hair styled in a way that suggested regular professional attention, and he filled the space with his bulk and his volume, asking Sophie in tones that assumed her compliance if everything was all right with his son, if she needed anything, his eyes never actually meeting hers because she was merely staff, barely visible in the hierarchy that organized his world. Sophie felt herself shrinking reflexively, felt her voice adopting the deferential tone that service workers used with people who could destroy them, with a complaint to management, and she hated herself for it, even as she recognized the survival mechanism at work. The way her body knew, before her conscious mind, that this man was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat, and everything to do with institutional power wielded without accountability or shame. The summons arrived at 4 in the morning, transmitted through the nursing supervisor's clipped phone call that woke Sophie from the brief rest she'd stolen in the break room. And the message carried the administrative weight that preceded career-defining moments, requesting her immediate presence in the second-floor conference room where the hospital's night administration apparently conducted business that couldn't wait for daylight or proper notice. Sophie moved through the corridors with growing dread, her exhaustion forgotten in the sharp clarity that fear provided, because spontaneous middle-of-the-night meetings in hospitals generally meant either catastrophic medical emergencies or the kind of personnel issues that ended with security escorting someone to collect their personal belongings from their locker. She'd been careful in room 422, hadn't documented anything beyond standard observations, hadn't even spoken to Evan beyond their brief exchange that could be interpreted as routine therapeutic communication, but she knew with sinking certainty that her attention to his case had been noticed and marked as problematic because institutions had ways of monitoring dissent even before it fully materialized into action. The conference room glowed with harsh overhead lighting that made everyone look slightly jaundiced and deeply tired, and Sophie entered to find 3 people waiting. Patricia Drummond, the hospital's senior legal counsel, her tailored navy suit impeccable despite the hour. Dr. Harrison, the attending who had admitted Evan, his face carefully neutral in the way of people protecting themselves from future liability. And James Kowalski, the night operations director, whose presence signaled that this meeting concerned institutional policy rather than clinical care. They arranged themselves on one side of the long table with deliberate formality, creating a visual barrier between Sophie and whatever they were about to deliver, and she took the single chair positioned opposite them, feeling like a defendant at a trial that had already reached its verdict before she arrived to offer defense. Patricia spoke first. her voice carrying the particular mix of concern and threat that corporate lawyers perfected through years of managing human problems that might damage organizational reputation, thanking Sophie for her dedication and asking if she'd had any concerns about patient Drake that she wanted to discuss before they reviewed standard protocols for high-profile admissions. The question was a trap wrapped in apparent openness, an invitation to incriminate herself by voicing observations that the hospital had clearly decided to classify as inappropriate curiosity rather than legitimate nursing assessment, and Sophie felt her throat constricting with the familiar helplessness of watching power operate against truth in real time. She'd been in versions of this room before, during her training, during previous positions at other hospitals where she'd asked inconvenient questions or documented things that made administrators uncomfortable, and she recognized the choreography of intimidation that followed seeing too much or caring too loudly in systems designed to process bodies efficiently rather than protect them comprehensively. Patricia continued without waiting for Sophie's response, explaining that Marcus Drake had expressed appreciation for the staff's professionalism, but had also noted that his family valued privacy during difficult times, that certain situations required discretion above standard documentation practices, her words carefully constructed to sound reasonable while delivering the unmistakable message that further attention to Evan's case would be interpreted as harassment of a grieving family dealing with a tragic accident. Dr. Harrison added his perspective with the weary authority of someone reading from an internal script, reminding Sophie that medical assessment was his responsibility and that nurses, while valued members of the care team, needed to operate within their scope of practice without projecting personal interpretations onto clinical situations. And the gendered condescension in his tone made her want to throw her tablet across the table, to demand what scope of practice excluded noticing when injuries didn't match explanations, when fear radiated from teenage bodies in ways that suggested ongoing danger rather than healing safety. Instead, she sat motionless and silent, knowing that any defense she offered would be used against her, that the meeting's purpose wasn't to gather her input, but to ensure her compliance through the mechanism of professional threat, and she felt something hardening in her chest, a furious determination that crystallized in proportion to their pressure for her acquiescence. James Kowalski produced documents on hospital letterhead, incident reports that needed her signature, acknowledging she had reviewed policies on patient confidentiality and appropriate professional boundaries, bureaucratic weapons that would later serve as evidence of her awareness and agreement, should she decide to pursue concerns through proper channels. Sophie took the papers with hands that had started trembling not from fear but from rage, from the accumulating weight of years spent watching systems protect themselves at the expense of vulnerable people. And she thought about her own mother, dismissing her childhood complaints about her stepfather's hands, the way authority figures had smiled and nodded while doing nothing. The scars she carried from learning that truth was often less powerful than the desire to avoid discomfort. She could sign the documents and return to her shift and let Evan disappear into whatever hell his father had constructed, could preserve her employment and her professional reputation and the precarious stability she'd built in the years since she'd escaped her own family's dysfunction. Or she could refuse to participate in the institutional gaslighting that was already reframing abuse as accident and her concern as overreach. Patricia's manicured finger tapped the signature line with meaningful emphasis, and Sophie felt time contracting to this single moment where her entire identity compressed into a choice between complicity and consequence, between the person she'd promised herself she would be when she took her nursing oath and the person the system demanded she become to survive within its walls. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sophie set down the unsigned papers and stood, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like something breaking. And she told them clearly that she wouldn't sign documents that functioned as preemptive absolution for ignoring signs of ongoing harm, that she'd noted patterns in Evan Drake's medical history that warranted investigation regardless of his father's board position or donation history. And she watched their faces shift from condescending patience to genuine alarm as they realized she was committing professional self-destruction in real time. Patricia's voice sharpened immediately, warning Sophie that refusing to sign would be documented as insubordination, that she was risking her license and her future in healthcare over speculation that had no basis in clinical evidence. And Dr. Harrison added that she was clearly experiencing burnout that was affecting her judgment, that she should take some time off to reconsider her position before making permanent decisions based on temporary emotional states. The words landed like slaps, each one designed to undermine her credibility by reframing her moral stance as psychological instability. And Sophie felt her professional identity crumbling, even as her sense of fundamental self-worth expanded, because some things mattered more than career survival. And protecting children from harm was supposed to be the foundational purpose of healthcare, not an optional extra that could be negotiated away when inconvenient for institutional peace. She left the conference room without waiting to be dismissed, her heart hammering against her ribs with the adrenaline of having burned bridges she couldn't rebuild, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had minutes rather than hours before they would move to contain whatever damage they perceived she might cause. The corridor felt different now, charged with the electricity of imminent confrontation, and Sophie moved through it with new purpose, her exhaustion falling away under the clarity of decision, and she pulled out her phone to photograph Evan's chart before anyone could alter it, to document the pattern of previous admissions she'd discovered during her review, the 2 other visits to St. Augustine within the past 18 months, both times with injuries attributed to sports accidents, both times with Marcus Drake present and requesting minimal documentation, a trail of harm that should have triggered mandatory reporting but had instead been carefully managed into invisibility through the mechanisms of wealth and institutional self-interest. The hospital's emergency lockdown protocols had been designed for active threats, for situations requiring immediate containment to prevent wider harm, and Sophie accessed them through the nursing station computer with hands that moved faster than her conscious thought, her fingers flying across the keyboard to initiate the sequence that would seal the 4th floor and summon security and create the chaos necessary for truth to surface before it could be permanently buried. The system demanded supervisor authorization, but she bypassed the requirement using an override code she'd memorized from a training drill years ago, hoping the procedure hadn't been updated since then. And when the confirmation screen flashed green, she felt simultaneously triumphant and terrified, because she'd just weaponized institutional safety mechanisms against the institution itself, had transformed protocols designed to protect into tools of exposure, and there would be no walking back from this precipice she'd just stepped off. The alarms erupted with the shrieking insistence of emergency systems activating across the entire floor, their piercing wail designed to penetrate sleep and shock people into immediate response. And Sophie watched the corridor transform as red emergency lights began cycling through their warning pattern, bathing everything in intermittent crimson shadow that made the familiar space feel alien and threatening. Doors began sealing automatically, their magnetic locks engaging with heavy metallic sounds that echoed the finality of her decision, and she could hear patients calling out in confusion and fear, their voices rising above the mechanical screaming of the alert system. Nurses emerging from other rooms to understand what catastrophe had triggered the lockdown, their faces painted in alternating darkness and red light as they tried to make sense of the sudden chaos. Sophie moved toward room 422, even as her colleagues tried to figure out whether they were securing against an intruder or a contamination event or some other crisis that would require specific protocols, and she felt the surreal disconnection of being both perpetrator and responder. The person who had created this emergency for the explicit purpose of making it impossible to maintain the silence that had protected Marcus Drake's systematic harm. Security arrived within minutes, their radios crackling with confused chatter about the unexpected lockdown, demanding to know who had initiated the alert and why no one had been notified in advance of a drill. And Sophie met them at the nurse's station, with her tablet displaying Evan's chart and the pattern of admissions she'd documented, speaking rapidly to explain the situation before they could dismiss her as hysterical or confused. She detailed the inconsistencies between the father's explanation and the physical evidence, the history of suspicious injuries that had been documented but never questioned, the way institutional power had functioned to shield ongoing abuse from appropriate investigation. And she watched the security officers' faces cycle through skepticism and concern as they tried to reconcile her calm, professional demeanor with the dramatic action she'd taken, trying to determine whether she was a whistleblower protecting a patient or a problem employee having some kind of breakdown that needed different management entirely. Marcus Drake emerged from his son's room like an avenging force, his face flushed with fury and something else, something that looked like genuine fear, as he realized his carefully constructed narrative was coming apart in public view, and he began shouting about lawsuits and consequences, about how Sophie had assaulted his family's privacy and traumatized his injured son with her reckless behavior, his voice booming through the corridor with the absolute confidence of someone who had never encountered meaningful resistance to his will. But the lockdown had drawn attention that couldn't be easily dismissed or managed, had pulled night administrators and patient advocates and even a social worker from the on-call schedule, had created witnesses to the confrontation who would have to document what transpired, and Sophie felt a grim satisfaction watching him realize that his usual tools of intimidation and influence were suddenly insufficient against the machinery of institutional accountability once it had been forcibly engaged. One of the security officers, an older man named Rodriguez, who Sophie had worked with during previous emergencies, studied Evan through the observation window with the careful attention of someone who had seen enough human suffering to recognize its patterns. And she watched him notice the boy's rigid posture, the way he pressed himself against the far wall as his father's voice escalated, the absolute terror on his face that no amount of performance could disguise in the moment of crisis. The floor remained in lockdown for 37 minutes while hospital administration tried to determine protocol for a situation that didn't fit any of their prepared scenarios. And during that time, Sophie gave her statement 3 separate times to different people, each iteration adding detail to the record she was building, creating documentation that would be harder to bury than the quiet observations of a single night nurse speaking alone against powerful interests. She described finding the pattern in Evan's medical history, explained her concerns about coercive control and ongoing danger, detailed the conference room meeting where she'd been pressured to sign documents that would have prevented further questions, and she felt her professional life ending with each word she spoke, even as she understood with crystalline clarity that she was doing the only thing her conscience would allow. Patricia Drummond appeared looking genuinely furious, threatening Sophie with immediate termination and legal action for misuse of emergency systems. But the presence of mandatory reporters changed the calculation, created obligations that even the hospital's legal counsel couldn't simply override. And Sophie watched the situation shift from personal vendetta to institutional liability, as people began considering what it would mean if they dismissed her concerns, and Evan later turned up seriously injured or worse. Child Protective Services arrived just before dawn, their presence transforming the situation from internal hospital matter to formal investigation. And Sophie felt the tension in her shoulders finally release slightly as she watched two caseworkers being briefed by Rodriguez and the patient advocate, understanding that whatever happened to her professionally, she had succeeded in making Evan visible to systems outside the hospital's control, had forced attention onto his situation in ways that would require official response rather than quiet management. Marcus Drake's threats escalated to include her personally, promising to destroy her career and sue her into poverty for defamation and harassment, but his words sounded increasingly hollow as the caseworkers entered his son's room and began the interview process that would determine next steps. And Sophie saw the moment when he realized that his power had limits, that wealth and institutional connection couldn't completely insulate him from scrutiny once the proper mechanisms had been triggered. She thought about all the children who never got this intervention, whose suffering remained invisible because no one was willing to risk themselves to make it seen, and she felt simultaneously exhausted and alive, drained by the confrontation but energized by the fundamental rightness of having acted according to her deepest values, even when the cost felt catastrophic. The lockdown lifted as sunrise began filtering through the windows, replacing the red emergency lights with ordinary morning grey, and Sophie stood in the corridor watching the floor return to its normal rhythms, while knowing that nothing would actually be normal again, that she had irrevocably altered the trajectory of multiple lives, including her own, through her decision to refuse complicity. Other nurses gave her wide berth, some with expressions of sympathy, others with obvious judgment, all of them understanding that she had violated the unspoken rule about not creating problems that affected everyone's working conditions, and she felt the loneliness of moral certainty, the isolation that came from choosing principles over belonging. Her supervisor appeared with the expected termination papers, delivered with regretful efficiency because hospitals couldn't afford employees who initiated false emergencies, regardless of their motivations, and Sophie signed them without argument, understanding that this consequence was both unjust and inevitable. The price systems extracted from those who refused to protect them at the expense of vulnerable people. She gathered her belongings from her locker while morning shift nurses arrived for report, their curious glances following her progress toward the exit, and she felt the strange lightness of having nothing left to lose, the paradoxical freedom that came from having already sacrificed what she'd been afraid of losing. In the parking lot, Sophie sat in her car without starting the engine, watching the hospital's windows catch the early light and transform into mirrors that reflected the sky's gradual brightening. And she thought about Evan and whatever investigation would follow, and whether she'd actually managed to protect him or simply created a different kind of chaos that wouldn't ultimately change his situation. Her phone held messages from colleagues and friends who'd already heard about the incident, offering support or concern or careful distance depending on their own relationship to institutional authority, and she didn't have energy to respond to any of them, felt too raw and uncertain to know what story she would tell about this night when enough time had passed for reflection. The morning air smelled like coming rain, that particular metallic freshness that preceded storms in Colorado, and Sophie rolled down her window to breathe it in, letting the cool touch her overheated skin, feeling the magnitude of what she'd done settling into her body alongside the fear of what came next, the practical concerns about employment and finances, and how she would rebuild a nursing career after being fired for cause from a major hospital. But underneath the anxiety, underneath the exhaustion and the looming dread of consequences, she felt something else, something that felt almost like peace, the knowledge that she had looked directly at suffering and chosen to respond rather than turn away, had refused to let institutional power determine the limits of her moral obligation, and whatever happened next. She would carry that refusal as proof that some part of herself remained intact and uncorrupted by the compromises that systems demanded. The hospital behind her continued its work, the machinery of healthcare grinding forward with or without her participation, and Sophie finally started her car and drove away from St. Augustine Medical Center, heading toward whatever future she'd just chosen by deciding that one boy's truth mattered more than her own safety, that some silences were too expensive to maintain regardless of the cost of breaking them.